can measure the depth of a man's love, not by how loudly he declares it, but by the stillness and strength in the way he speaks to you. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. Most people have been conditioned to associate love with excitement, dramatics, or intensity. But in truth, genuine love, especially from a man who has cultivated emotional mastery, expresses itself with grounded words, spoken not to gain attention, but to give it, not to control, but to connect. When a man deeply loves you, his language changes. His voice softens, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. His tone slows, not out of hesitation, but out of carefulness. His words shift, not to impress you, but to include you. These are not just romantic gestures. They are physiological, psychological, and spiritual signals that he has stopped speaking from his surface mind and has begun communicating from his core. His love no longer comes from a place of needing to be chosen, but from a place of already having chosen you. Fully, quietly, and without condition. When a man deeply loves, something profound begins to shift, not just in his behavior, but in the subtle rhythms of his nervous system. The way he speaks changes. Not in volume, not in drama, but in vibration. His words begin to carry a kind of resonance, like a drum that's been hollowed, and now knows how to echo with meaning. In moments of true love, the male body moves out of survival mode. The sympathetic nervous system, often alert and ready to protect or compete, quiets. Instead, the parasympathetic system, the one responsible for rest, connection, and healing, takes over. This is not just poetic, it's biological. When a man feels emotionally safe, his heartbeat slows, his breathing deepens, and his voice begins to reflect calm rather than control. He's not trying to prove himself, he's trying to share himself. You'll notice that he doesn't rush to fill silence. He pauses between his sentences, not because he's unsure, but because he's present. He's listening as much as he's speaking. In fact, his silence says more than words often can. It communicates trust. He trusts you with his pauses, with his breath, with the space between his thoughts. Many women say they long for a man who will speak with intention. But intention doesn't begin in language. It begins in the body. It begins when a man is no longer operating out of fear, competition, or the old wounds of being misunderstood. It begins when he realizes that the goal is not to be impressive, but to be attuned. There's a simple story of a retired martial artist who once fell in love late in life. People noticed how calm he became. They said, "He used to speak like fire. Now he speaks like water." Someone asked him why. He said, "Because before her, I was always preparing to fight. But now I'm learning how to stay." This story, brief as it is, holds a mirror to the nervous system of a man in love. His system, once armored, becomes a garden, and from that garden, different words begin to grow. He starts saying things like, "I heard you," instead of, "I don't have time for this." He says, "What do you need right now?" rather than, "You're overreacting." And he begins to say, "I want to understand, even if I don't agree." These aren't just phrases. They are physiological markers of emotional regulation. He is no longer driven by impulse. He is responding from presence. There is something deeply spiritual about this transition. The body calms, and the heart finally gets a chance to speak. And the heart does not shout. It speaks gently, because it knows anything real doesn't need to be forced. Women who have experienced this kind of energy in a man often describe it as feeling held, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, even energetically. It is the sense that his words are not knives to cut or ladders to climb, but bridges. And each bridge leads not away from her, but closer to her. This kind of communication does not emerge without practice. It often follows struggle. Many men spend years learning to speak from their minds, from logic, from facts and defense mechanisms, but to speak from a calm body. This requires a kind of surrender. A man must be brave enough to let go of performance. He must be humble enough to sit with discomfort, to breathe through it, and to remain present. And what does this presence give to a woman? Everything. Because when a man is not speaking to control her, she finally feels safe to unfold. When his nervous system is stable, her emotional body begins to trust. And that trust is the foundation of all real intimacy. There is no real love without safety. And there is no safety without a man who has learned how to calm his own storm. The words of a man in love will begin to sound less like declarations and more like invitations. He says, "Tell me how you feel," because he's not afraid of her feelings anymore. He says, "I'm here," because he's not planning his escape. He says, "Let's take our time," because he understands that real connection cannot be rushed. The nervous system has its own tempo, and love, at its deepest level, always moves at the speed of truth. In one conversation, a woman shared how her partner would always text her several times a day when they were first dating, but those messages often felt like obligations. "Good morning. How was your day?" They were there, but they were hollow. Then one day, he sent her a voice message. His voice was slow, steady. He said, "I just wanted you to hear how calm I feel when I think of you." That single sentence, spoken with presence, shifted everything. It was no longer about quantity. It was about quality. His nervous system had caught up with his heart. The body does not lie. You can hear when someone is calm. You can feel it in the way they say your name, in the way they pause after you speak, in the way they don't try to fix everything but instead offer their presence. Love is not about fixing. It is about witnessing, without flinching. And this leads us into the second transformation that occurs when a man deeply loves. He begins to speak from his essence, not his ego. The ego always seeks something. It wants validation, control, power, or admiration. When a man speaks from ego, his words are coated in performance. He is trying to win. He might use charm, wit, or even silence as tools to stay ahead. He measures conversations like chess games. What move will give him the upper hand? This kind of energy is exhausting, not just for the woman, but for the man himself. Because in truth, the ego is always afraid. But love, real love, does not emerge from fear. It arises from the essence of who someone is, and essence has no need to compete. When a man begins to love deeply, he no longer wants to impress. He wants to express. There's a fundamental shift from seeking to being, and with that shift comes a new vocabulary. Instead of saying, "Look at what I did for you," he might say, "This made me think of you." Instead of saying, "You're lucky to have me," he begins to say, "I'm grateful we found each other." His tone softens. His phrases stop being self-centered. They become relational. He moves from me to we. This is a kind of maturity that cannot be faked. It shows up in the way he owns his mistakes, in the way he says, "I was wrong and I want to do better," without defensiveness, in the way he asks, "What matters to you right now?" Instead of assuming he already knows. When ego steps aside, curiosity steps in. And curiosity is one of the most sacred energies in a relationship. Because curiosity says, "You are a mystery I want to keep exploring." It says, "You are worth knowing again and again, even if I think I already know you." This kind of language is not passive, it is alive. And it keeps love from growing stagnant. There's a powerful moment that often happens in the quiet hours of deep partnership. It is when a man looks at the woman he loves, not with lust, not with entitlement, but with awe. And in that moment, his words are simple. He says something like, "I still can't believe I get to know you." These are not poetic lines rehearsed for approval. They are real-time expressions of presence. They come from a heart that is awake. This awakening doesn't happen by accident. It often comes after failure, after heartbreak, after realizing that manipulation, charm, and surface level confidence are brittle and hollow. Essence, on the other hand, is rooted. It is resilient. It speaks without fear of being misunderstood because it is not trying to be perfect. It is simply trying to be true. One man, in reflecting on his transformation after years of shallow relationships, said, "I used to say what I thought women wanted to hear. Now I say what I feel, even if it's messy. I'd rather be real than be right." That is the voice of essence speaking. That is a man who has stopped performing and started participating. And women feel the difference immediately, because words from ego often feel heavy. They come with an agenda. They twist the emotional atmosphere. But words from essence feel light, not because they lack depth, but because they are free of manipulation. They land gently. They invite openness. It's important to remember, when a man speaks from essence, he is no longer trying to control outcomes. He is not speaking to secure a label, to rush a commitment, or to dominate the emotional space. He is speaking because he values shared reality. And in shared reality, both people matter. This leads to a new kind of intimacy, not one driven by neediness or strategy, but by respect, by mutual reverence. In this space, a woman begins to relax. Her body softens. Her energy opens, not because she was convinced, but because she was met. And in being met, not manipulated, she begins to trust again. Not just in him, but in the possibility of love that is rooted, calm, and real. The journey from ego to essence is not linear. It requires humility, self-awareness, and practice. It is a path of unlearning performance and remembering presence. It is about being more human, not more perfect. And when a man begins to walk this path, his words become medicine. Not because they promise the world, but because they come from a world within him that has already been made whole. There is a kind of love that speaks without needing to say very much at all. A love that reveals itself not in grand speeches, but in subtle energies, the tone of the voice, the rhythm of the breath, the warmth behind the words. When a man deeply loves, his language shifts from performance to presence. He no longer speaks to gain admiration or to protect his ego. Instead, he speaks to connect, to co-regulate, and to honor the moment unfolding between two souls. Presence, in its deepest form, is not passive. It is a powerful act of attention. To be present with another human being, truly present, is to offer something sacred, undivided awareness. In the realm of relationships, this kind of presence becomes one of the highest forms of love. And when a man speaks from that place, his words no longer carry the need to dominate. They begin to calm, to hold, to affirm. For much of his life, a man may have learned that communication is about results, about fixing, about debating, about asserting his point of view. He may have been taught that strength is in volume, in persuasion, or in certainty. But when he falls deeply in love, a new awareness emerges. He begins to see that real strength lies in stillness. That to be heard does not require being loud, and that to be understood, he must first learn to listen, not only with his ears, but with his energy. There's a quiet wisdom that grows inside a man when he learns to be fully present with a woman, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He starts to understand that silence isn't empty. It's a space that holds everything. In that silence, he can feel what she is truly saying, even beyond her words. He starts to notice the way her shoulders tighten when she's been carrying too much. He hears the weight in her sigh before she speaks. And when he does speak, he doesn't rush to solve her problems. He simply says, "I'm with you." Those three words, when spoken with presence, carry more healing than any well rehearsed advice ever could. To speak from presence is to let go of agenda. It means a man is not trying to impress, rescue, or even perform emotional sensitivity. He is simply offering his full attention, undistracted, undivided. In today's world of constant stimulation, that is rare. We live in a culture that encourages multitasking, where people speak while scrolling, where they nod while checking their phones, where conversations are measured in replies, not resonance. And yet, the human heart yearns to be felt, not just heard. A woman knows the difference. She knows when a man is listening just long enough to speak again. And she knows when he's truly absorbing her words, holding them in the quiet of his body, allowing them to move through him. That kind of listening cannot be faked. It requires discipline. It requires slowing down the breath, setting aside the ego, and letting the other person matter more than your opinion. One evening, a woman sat across the table from her partner after a long day. She tried to explain how overwhelmed she felt. By work, by family, by the silent pressure to hold everything together. Midway through her sentence, he reached for his phone to check a notification. She stopped speaking. She didn't raise her voice. She simply became quiet. A few seconds later, he looked up and said, "You can continue." But something had already broken. She no longer felt safe to open. Not because of what he said, but because of where his attention had gone. This is the wound so many people carry, not of harsh words, but of divided presence. It is the ache of speaking into a room that isn't fully listening. But presence, real, grounded, and loving presence, heals that. When a man truly loves, he begins to treat every conversation as sacred. He places his phone face down. He leans in slightly, not out of habit, but because his body is genuinely attuned. He lets his partner finish her sentence, even if he disagrees. He breathes before responding, giving space for her emotions to settle. And when he speaks, he does so with an inner stillness that says, "I value this connection more than being right." This shift may seem small, but its impact is massive. Emotional presence is one of the most powerful regulators of the nervous system. When two people are attuned, when their energies are not at war, a deep peace emerges. Arguments become dialogues, tension becomes intimacy, and in this sacred space, love deepens, not through gifts or declarations, but through the gentle act of being with each other fully. There's a man who once described the moment he realized he had been performing in relationships. He said, "I used to say the right things, ask the right questions, and pretend to listen. But inside, I was planning what I'd say next." I didn't realize that love doesn't ask you to perform. It asks you to pause, to stop being clever and start being real. That awakening changed the way he spoke. He stopped using words to steer the conversation and started using silence to support it. This is the transformation that happens when a man steps into emotional maturity. He stops speaking from his head alone and begins to speak from the fullness of his being. There is a warmth in his voice, a slowness in his replies, a softness in his tone. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of depth. A woman, in the presence of such energy, starts to relax into herself. She no longer feels the need to over-explain, to defend, or to manage his emotions. She feels met, and being met allows her to blossom, not in fear, but in freedom. Presence also teaches a man to become aware of his emotional triggers. In the past, he may have reacted defensively to her sadness or frustration, seeing it as an attack or an accusation. But now, with presence, he begins to understand. He listens beyond her tone. He feels her exhaustion, her longing to be understood, her fear of not being enough. And instead of reacting, he responds. He might say something as simple as, "That must be hard," or "Tell me more about what that feels like." These responses, grounded in presence, invite healing. Real communication is not just about words. It is about energy. When a man stays present, even in discomfort, he communicates, "You're safe with me." That safety is not just emotional. It is somatic. It's felt in the body. Her nervous system begins to mirror his. This is what scientists refer to as co-regulation. The way two human beings can bring each other back into calm simply by remaining emotionally attuned. This is why presence is more powerful than performance. Performance says, "Look at me." Presence says, "I'm here with you." Performance says, "Let me impress you." Presence says, "Let me understand you." And when a woman feels understood, not because a man is using perfect words, but because his energy is steady and his heart is open, love grows, trust builds, emotional walls begin to dissolve. There is a quote often shared in mindfulness circles: "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." In a world of quick fixes and shallow distractions, the ability to give someone your full attention becomes a radical act of love. A man who learns this not only transforms his relationships, but transforms himself. Because presence is not just a gift to others, it is a mirror. It reveals our own patterns, our fears, our unhealed wounds. It asks us to slow down long enough to see ourselves clearly. And so, the man who learns to speak from presence also learns to be with himself. He no longer needs to run from silence. He becomes familiar with his own emotions. He allows grief, vulnerability, and uncertainty to move through him without resistance. And that internal stillness reflects outward. His presence becomes medicine, not because he has the answers, but because he can sit with the questions. This kind of man does not rush love. He does not push conversations past their natural pace. He trusts that connection is built slowly, layer by layer, through moments of truth and shared breath. He does not dominate the dialogue. He allows it to flow. And in doing so, he invites a deeper kind of intimacy, one not based on excitement alone, but on grounded, enduring presence. A couple once described the turning point in their relationship as the night they sat on their balcony and said nothing for almost 20 minutes. They had been arguing earlier, trying to solve things with words. But that night, they just sat. No plans, no solutions, just presence. She later said, "That was the night I knew we would be okay." Not because of what he said, but because he didn't leave when there was nothing to say. This is the power of grounded love. It doesn't perform, it holds. In the end, the presence of a deeply loving man is felt before it is heard. It is in the way he looks into your eyes and stays there, not because he's searching for something, but because he's choosing to remain. It is in the way he doesn't interrupt. It is in the way he lets your emotions breathe. It is in the way he offers quiet reassurance. Not just through what he says, but through what he allows you to feel. To speak from presence is to turn conversation into communion. And in communion, two people do not just talk, they become known to one another. Not through performance, but through the sacred art of being fully, lovingly here. There comes a moment in a man's life, especially when love begins to deepen, when he is asked by life itself to develop a new kind of language. This language is not taught in classrooms or modeled in movies. It does not come from the need to impress or dominate. It comes from a deeper place, one that many men are unfamiliar with until they are truly seen by someone who invites them into emotional truth. And that someone is often the woman they love. In the early stages of many relationships, it is common for conversations to skim the surface. Words are exchanged for validation, for humor, for attraction. There is charm, there is wit, there is rhythm. But charm can only carry a relationship so far. At some point, when the soul of a woman begins to call for deeper resonance, she no longer wants just answers. She seeks presence. And more than that, she seeks a man who can speak the language of feeling, the language of his inner world. This is where many men begin to struggle. Not because they do not feel, but because they have not been taught to name what they feel. A man may feel tension in his chest, a tightness in his stomach, a lump in his throat. But when asked to describe it, he may simply respond with, "I'm fine," or "I don't know." These phrases do not reflect the absence of feeling. They reflect the absence of vocabulary. And this absence is not a personal failure. It is cultural, generational, systemic. From a young age, many boys are taught to equate emotion with weakness. Crying is shamed. Vulnerability is punished. Sensitivity is seen as something to be erased. The result is that by the time a man reaches adulthood, he may have a full emotional experience inside him, but only a handful of phrases to express it. His inner world is full, but his emotional language is underdeveloped. But something changes when he deeply loves a woman. Love, especially a love that is emotionally mature, acts as a mirror. It reflects back to a man what is not yet fully known within himself. A woman who loves him doesn't just want to hear what happened at work. She wants to know how it made him feel. She wants to understand what weighs on his heart, what keeps him awake at night, what he longs for when the world goes quiet. And slowly, often clumsily at first, he begins to search for the words. In the beginning, it might come out in incomplete sentences, in pauses, in the occasional "I don't know how to explain it." But if he continues walking this path, something begins to shift. His emotional vocabulary expands. He no longer just says, "I'm angry." He begins to say, "I felt dismissed today, like my effort wasn't valued." He no longer just says, "I'm stressed." He says, "I'm overwhelmed by the pressure to provide, and I'm afraid of failing." These are not just deeper sentences. They are revelations. They are signs that a man is becoming intimate with his own heart. And when a man becomes intimate with his inner world, everything in the relationship changes. His partner begins to feel less like she's speaking into a void and more like she's being joined in the space between. Emotional language creates a bridge. It allows two people to meet not only through logic, but through shared vulnerability. And vulnerability, when practiced with courage and presence, becomes a doorway to spiritual connection. There is a story of a couple who had been married for 12 years. The woman often expressed that she didn't feel emotionally close to her husband. He provided, he was loyal, he was present in the room. But emotionally, she felt alone. One evening, after a particularly silent dinner, she finally asked, "Do you even feel anything about us anymore?" He hesitated, stared at his plate, and quietly said, "I feel tight in my chest all the time, like there's something I need to say, but I don't know how." That sentence, simple as it was, broke open years of emotional distance, not because it was poetic, but because it was honest. It was the beginning of a man finding his voice, not his outer voice, but his emotional one. It is important to understand that emotional vocabulary is not just about words. It's about access. Access to one's inner state. Access to the subtle shifts of mood and thought that often go unnoticed. A man learning to speak this way becomes more aware of his reactions. He notices when his frustration is really hiding fear. He recognizes when his silence is masking sadness. And most importantly, he begins to name these things, not just for his partner, but for himself. Naming an emotion does not weaken a man. It grounds him. Neuroscience shows that when we label a feeling, we reduce its intensity. This is known as affect labeling. By simply saying, "I feel anxious," the brain begins to deactivate the amygdala, the fear center, and activates the prefrontal cortex, which governs rational thinking. In other words, finding the right words helps us regain control. It helps us respond rather than react. So when a man says, "I'm hurt because I didn't feel included in that decision," he is not being dramatic. He is demonstrating emotional intelligence. He is choosing clarity over confusion. He is moving out of survival mode and into connection. Women often carry a tremendous emotional burden in relationships because they are expected to be the feelers, the processors, the translators. But when a man begins to meet her with equal emotional language, the dynamic shifts. The weight is shared. Communication becomes collaborative. There is a sense of us, not just you and me. And emotional vocabulary is not only for conflict. It is for joy, for admiration, for desire. A man who loves deeply doesn't just say, "You look beautiful." He says, "When I see you smile like that, I feel peaceful inside." He doesn't just say, "I'm happy to be with you." He says, "Being next to you calms something in me I didn't even know needed soothing." These are not lines from a script. They are words born from awareness, emotional awareness. There is a moment, usually quiet and unexpected, when a woman hears her partner express something emotionally real and precise for the first time. Maybe he says, "I felt insecure when you spoke to him, and I was ashamed to admit it." In that moment, her whole body softens. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real. And being real is always more powerful than being polished. Men often ask, "How do I start developing this kind of vocabulary?" The answer is simple, but not easy. It begins with listening to oneself. At the end of the day, instead of asking, "What did I do today?" ask, "What did I feel today?" Instead of brushing off emotions with, "I'm good," ask, "What's moving inside me that I haven't acknowledged?" This is not self-indulgent. This is self-awareness. And self-awareness is the foundation of emotional intimacy. Practicing emotional vocabulary can begin with writing. Keeping a journal, even for 5 minutes a day, helps a man recognize patterns. Today I felt frustrated when I was interrupted. I noticed sadness when I saw that old photo. These are the seeds. Over time, they grow into clarity, and clarity becomes the soil in which love can thrive. In relationships, clarity prevents conflict. It reduces assumptions. A man who can say, "I'm not distant because I don't care, I'm distant because I'm afraid of being misunderstood," offers his partner a roadmap. She no longer has to guess, interpret, or take things personally. She can respond with understanding instead of defensiveness. Even in apology, emotional vocabulary changes everything. Compare "I'm sorry" with "I'm sorry I dismissed your feelings. I realize now I felt overwhelmed, and instead of sharing that, I shut down. That wasn't fair to you." One of these is surface level. The other is a doorway to healing, because true apologies don't just admit wrongdoing. They illuminate why it happened. And that illumination creates safety. There's another aspect to emotional vocabulary that's often overlooked. It helps a man feel more powerful, not less. The ability to express one's feelings is not weakness. It is mastery. Emotional fluency allows a man to navigate the complex terrain of relationship with steadiness. He is not thrown off by his own reactions. He is not afraid of her tears. He knows what's happening within him, and he's able to share it clearly, calmly, and with intention. And this is deeply attractive. There is nothing more grounding than being with someone who knows how to name their emotions, not to control the other person, but to connect more deeply. This kind of communication is not noisy. It is not filled with intensity or blame. It is quiet and powerful. It says, "I trust you enough to show you where I really am." And trust is the foundation of everything. When a man develops emotional vocabulary, he is doing more than learning how to talk. He is learning how to reveal. And in revealing himself, he invites his partner to do the same. Together, They step into a space where masks fall away, and the truth of who they are can be seen, honored, and embraced. There is a quiet moment of triumph when a man, once silent about his emotions, finally looks into the eyes of the woman he loves and says, "I feel safe with you." Not because everything is perfect, not because he has no fears, but because he has found his voice, and with it, he has begun the real work of love. In the beginning of many relationships, most people are still speaking the language of transaction. It's subtle and often unconscious, yet it runs deep. It sounds like, "I did this, so you should appreciate me." Or, "If you loved me, you would have known what I needed." These are not malicious statements. They are reflections of emotional conditioning, a pattern of giving in order to get, of offering love with invisible strings attached. But when love matures, when it reaches a deeper, more conscious level, a quiet revolution begins to unfold. Words that were once transactional start to transform. The very energy behind the way a man speaks begins to shift from obligation to offering. This transformation is not flashy, it's not loud, but it's powerful. It begins the moment a man stops treating love as something to negotiate and starts seeing it as something to nurture. You can hear it in the way he starts phrasing his care. He no longer says, "I guess I'll do it if you really want me to," with a heavy sigh of martyrdom. Instead, he says, "I'd like to help because I see how much this matters to you." The same action is taken, but the energy behind the words is different. One drains love, the other deepens it. There's a profound difference between doing something out of duty and doing something out of devotion. Duty is heavy. It carries resentment in its shadows. Devotion is light not because it's easy, but because it's voluntary. A deeply loving man doesn't feel imprisoned by his love. He feels empowered by it. Not because he is trying to earn praise, but because contribution brings him inner satisfaction. He no longer asks, "What am I getting out of this?" Instead, he asks, "How can I serve this bond in a way that reflects my truth?" This does not mean he loses himself. In fact, it means he has found more of himself, because only someone who has cultivated inner abundance can give without the anxiety of depletion. Only someone who is no longer starving for emotional validation can offer love freely without needing it to be perfectly mirrored back. There's a quiet strength in a man who doesn't count what he gives. He doesn't keep score. He doesn't tally emotional debts. Instead, his gestures, his words, and his presence arise from a deep understanding that contribution is not currency, it is communion. That love is not a market of exchange, but a sacred space where giving becomes a form of becoming. A woman once described a moment when she had fallen sick unexpectedly. She was overwhelmed with fever and fatigue, and her partner showed up after work with warm soup, cold towels, and silent presence. He didn't say, "You owe me for this." He didn't point to the inconvenience. He simply cared for her with attentiveness and ease. Later, when she thanked him, he quietly responded, "It made me feel good to be able to be there for you." That single line told her everything. He hadn't acted from a sense of role or requirement. He acted from alignment. This is what begins to emerge when a man stops viewing his actions as leverage and starts seeing them as language. A language of love that is quiet, consistent, and rooted in integrity. When he says, "How was your day?" he isn't reciting a script, he is genuinely curious. When he says, "Can I carry that for you?" he isn't trying to impress her with strength. He is offering a moment of relief because he understands that love isn't just words, it's weight, sharing. The most profound connections are not created in grand declarations, but in small, repeated gestures of sincere contribution. A man who is deeply loving no longer needs to be seen doing something valuable to feel valuable. He begins to find self-worth not in being admired, but in being useful, quietly, consistently, without needing applause. This maturity in love is not age-based, it's awareness-based. Some people in their 50s are still bargaining in relationships, while others in their 20s are already speaking the language of service and intention. The key difference lies in consciousness. In a transactional mindset, the undercurrent is always, what's in it for me? In a transformed heart, the question becomes, what wants to flow through me? This change doesn't mean a man becomes a people pleaser or loses his boundaries. Quite the opposite, because when a man speaks and acts from contribution, he is no longer seeking approval. He knows his why, he knows his limits, and because his love is no longer rooted in performance, he can say no without guilt and yes without needing recognition. His giving becomes clean, uncluttered by need, unburdened by manipulation. There's a beautiful passage in an old Zen teaching. When the heart is clear, action is pure. This is the essence of contribution without expectation. When a man's heart is clear, clear of unresolved pain, of unspoken needs, of egoic hunger, his actions become pure. They become extensions of his state, not strategies for attention. And this clarity shows up in everyday moments. He starts saying things like, let's plan something that brings you joy, instead of, what do I have to do now? He asks, what would support you right now? Not to check off a box, but because he genuinely wants to create ease. His words no longer feel heavy with resentment or loaded with hidden meanings. They are simple, direct, and kind. This kind of communication builds trust over time. Trust is not built on dramatic gestures. It is built on dependable presence. When a woman hears her partner consistently speak and act from a place of real contribution, she begins to relax her guard. She no longer fears emotional debt. She doesn't feel like love is being tullied. Instead, she feels invited into a space where both partners contribute as an expression of who they are, not as a bargaining chip for who they want the other to become. A man who speaks this way has usually gone through the fire of self-reflection. He has likely faced the parts of himself that once needed to be needed. He has seen how conditional his past giving may have been. He has noticed when he gave affection in hopes of receiving it back, or when he did things to prove his worth. But instead of shaming himself, he used that awareness to grow, to evolve, to build a new foundation, not on approval, but on alignment. And in this alignment, his energy becomes nourishing. His partner feels replenished by his presence, not drained, because he is not projecting need or expectation. He becomes someone she can lean on without fear of being emotionally taxed. He becomes an oasis in a world of transaction. There's a powerful story of a woman who had experienced many relationships where love felt like a scoreboard. Every gesture was weighed, every favor came with a reminder, and emotional intimacy was something she had to earn. Then she met a man who, on their third date, picked up her favorite book and had highlighted his favorite lines. When she asked why, he said, I just wanted to understand what speaks to you. That was the moment she realized this man didn't see her as a project. He saw her as a person, and he wasn't trying to win her. He was trying to meet her. These are the moments that mark the transition from transaction to transformation. They are subtle but unmistakable. They come through phrases like, what matters to you today? Or, I just wanted to check in, not because I have to, but because I want to. They come through actions that don't need to be announced. A folded blanket, a warm meal, a small note left behind. None of these acts say, no, you owe me. They simply say, I see you. The deepest relationships are not those without conflict, but those where the foundation is not threatened by it. When a man consistently communicates from contribution, his partner knows that disagreements are not withdrawals, they are opportunities. She knows that beneath the challenge, there is still care, still effort, still offering, because his love is not conditional on her perfection. It is based on his own decision to keep showing up, not to be rewarded, but to be real. And this way of being becomes infectious. As he shifts his energy from trade to tenderness, the relationship changes shape. It becomes a place where both people feel free to give, not because they must, but because they are moved to. There is a flow that replaces the friction. And in this flow, intimacy becomes more than closeness. It becomes safety. A man who communicates like this is not afraid of emotional labor. He does not see checking in, listening deeply, or adjusting his actions as burdens. He sees them as part of the sacred work of love. He knows that love is not passive. It is active. It requires tending, like a fire that burns steadily only when fed with care, patience, and presence. And so he begins to speak from that fire, not from pressure, not from pretense, but from the warmth of someone who is rooted in himself. His voice no longer asks, "Do you love me enough to make me feel whole?" His voice says, "I love you from a place that is already whole." This is how transformation becomes visible through language, not in poetic speeches, not in dramatic overtures, but in the simple, consistent offering of self that says, again and again, in ways both spoken and unspoken, "I am here, not because I'm keeping score, but because I choose this, I choose you. And in choosing you, I choose to give, not to get something back, but to build something lasting." There comes a subtle but powerful moment in a man's evolution when his language becomes less about performance and more about protection. And not protection in the conventional sense, not just guarding someone physically, but guarding their peace, their energy, their emotional safety. This transformation in speech reflects something much deeper than affection. It reflects spiritual maturity. A man who deeply loves begins to say things like, "I won't let anything disturb the space we're building," or "You can rest here." And behind those words is not just comfort, there is commitment. Most people assume love is proven in what you do, but the deeper truth is this love is revealed in how you guard what you both create. Every relationship becomes a shared field of energy, a sacred environment. And in that space, words either build safety or they quietly erode it. A man who has matured in love becomes highly aware of this. He stops speaking carelessly. He no longer uses language to deflect blame, to protect his ego, or to escape responsibility. He begins to speak like a guardian of the emotional atmosphere. This guardianship is not controlling. It is attuned. It means he's sensitive to when the room feels heavy, when words feel sharp, when the energy between him and his partner begins to shift. And rather than pointing outward, saying, "Why are you acting this way?" he turns inward and asks, "What am I contributing to this moment?" This level of responsibility takes discipline. It requires a man to master his impulses, to pause before reacting, and to develop an emotional radar that's not guided by fear but by care. In many relationships, people speak to win. They speak to be right. But in sacred connection, a man speaks to bring balance, and you'll hear it in how he frames things. Instead of, "You always do this," he says, "When this happens, it makes me feel distant from you, and that's not what I want." Instead of, "This is your fault," he'll say, "This is affecting us both, and I want us to understand it together." His language becomes collaborative. It doesn't tear down, it repairs. And this is what distinguishes a man who is in love from a man who is simply in attachment. There's a story of a man who was once deeply reactive. He admitted that when arguments came, he'd say things just to win. Sharp words, insults, accusations. But after he lost someone important to him, because of that pattern, he began to see that every sentence is a seed. Some seeds grow into healing, others into harm, so he began to train himself differently. Before speaking, he'd ask himself, will this create safety or will it create fear? That one question changed the entire landscape of his communication. A woman doesn't feel safe just because a man is physically present. She feels safe when she knows his presence brings peace, not pressure, that he won't weaponize her vulnerability, that he won't use her emotions as ammunition, that when she's upset, confused, or afraid, he won't mock or dismiss her, but create a space where she can exhale and be held. And sometimes protection doesn't look like doing anything dramatic. It looks like a man sitting with his partner in silence after a hard day, not offering solutions, but simply saying, I'm not going anywhere. It looks like saying, let's not raise our voices. When the energy starts to rise, it looks like him refusing to bring outside chaos into the shared space, whether that's anger from work, opinions from family, or the noise of social media. His love becomes a filter, not to block reality, but to keep the sacred protected. When a man speaks from this space, he also begins to make declarations that aren't about dominance, but about dedication. He says things like, this relationship matters to me more than being right, or I want us to feel safe even when we don't agree. These aren't rehearsed lines. They are insights that come from self-awareness. And they tell a woman everything she needs to know. Not about how charming he is, but how conscious he is. It is easy to love someone when everything is calm. But it is in conflict that the true nature of someone's speech is revealed. Some men use arguments to release their pain, to project their insecurities, to unload their emotional baggage. But a man who is rooted will not let conflict compromise the sanctity of the space he's building. He will not call names, raise his voice recklessly, or make threats, because he knows that one word spoken in haste can take weeks, sometimes years, to undo. And that's where emotional protection becomes a practice, not a personality trait. It means choosing to breathe before speaking, choosing to understand before judging, choosing to ask, how can we come back to center? Rather than, how can I win this? A woman once shared how her partner would always say, we're on the same team during difficult moments. It wasn't a fancy sentence. But every time she heard it, her nervous system relaxed. Because in those words was a commitment not just to love, but to unity. And unity is what protection in love is all about. It's not about shielding someone from life. It's about ensuring that in the midst of life's storms, your relationship remains a place of peace. Sometimes this protective language shows up not in what is said, but in what is not said. A man who loves deeply knows when silence is more powerful than defense. He learns not to respond to every criticism. He learns that sometimes just listening, truly listening, is the most healing form of speech. And when he does speak, he chooses words that stabilize rather than escalate. There's a quiet power in the way he says, I understand, or I hear you, or even just, I'm sorry you felt that. These aren't passive phrases. They're intentional. They're bridges. They say, I am willing to step out of my perspective and stand with you, even if I don't fully understand yet. That is protection, not of the body, but of the bond. And he protects her dreams too. When she shares something delicate, a hope, an idea, a vision, he doesn't belittle it. He doesn't respond with cynicism or sarcasm. He nurtures it, even if he doesn't fully get it yet. Because love is not only about protecting from harm, it's about protecting possibility. When a man can say, that sounds beautiful, how can I support it? He is not just being encouraging. He is being expansive. He's creating space for his partner to grow without fear of rejection. This kind of language is rare, not because men are incapable of it, but because it requires something that is often neglected in society: inner stillness. A man cannot protect others emotionally if his own mind is in chaos. So he begins by protecting himself, by creating internal clarity, by processing his emotions instead of projecting them, by learning to sit with discomfort rather than running from it. And from that inner discipline, his speech transforms. He no longer uses words to distract, he uses them to align. His partner knows that when he speaks, he means what he says, that he won't make promises to quiet the moment and break them tomorrow, that he won't say, "I'm okay," when he's full of resentment, that he won't punish with silence. This is emotional maturity, and it's the truest form of protection. There's a quote that says, "Love is not about possession. Love is about protection." That doesn't mean control. It means care. It means that when a man sees his partner anxious, he doesn't dismiss her feelings. He slows down. He offers grounding. He says things like, "Let's not make any decisions right now. Let's just sit together." Or, "Your feelings matter to me, even the ones I don't yet understand." These words may seem small, but in the world of relationship, they are enormous. Because when a woman feels emotionally protected, her entire body responds. Her nervous system settles, her voice softens, her creativity returns, and not because she has been rescued, but because she knows she can be real, that she can bring all of herself into the space without it being used against her, that she can speak her truth without being punished for it. A man who understands this doesn't see his role as fixing everything. He sees his role as holding the space where everything can be seen, heard, and honored. He becomes a container, not a critic. And in that container, love doesn't just survive. It deepens. It matures. It becomes sacred. What's often missed in conversations about masculinity is that protection is not always loud. It is not always about defending from an external enemy. Sometimes it's about being mindful of the inner environment you are co-creating with your partner. It's about saying, "Let's not speak like that," not out of control, but out of care. It's about refusing to bring poison into the shared space, even when you feel justified. Because love does not grow in chaos. It grows in clarity. So the man who loves deeply begins to use language that creates clarity, not confusion. Assurance, not insecurity. Connection, not competition. He becomes the kind of partner who, even in disagreement, never leaves the other person doubting their value. He becomes a guardian not just of her body, but of her spirit. Not just of the relationship, but of the emotional tone within it. And when this happens, something rare and beautiful unfolds. Both partners begin to exhale. The energy shifts. Words become tools of healing, not weapons of control. Love becomes less about finding the right person and more about becoming the right presence. A presence that protects, not with force, but with intention. Not with volume, but with vision. Not by being perfect, but by being present. Always. When a man deeply loves, his entire way of relating shifts from performance to presence, from transaction to transformation. His words become more than sound. They become extensions of his inner clarity, reflections of his grounded intention. He no longer speaks to impress or to gain favor. He speaks to connect, to support, and to protect what is sacred between him and the one he cherishes. In his presence, a woman doesn't just feel wanted. She feels seen, heard, and emotionally safe. He begins to say things that aren't rehearsed, but revealed. "I'm listening. Tell me what's really on your heart. I want to understand. Let me hold space for you. I'm with you, even when it's hard." Each of these is not just a phrase. It is a doorway to intimacy, a declaration that his love is not passive or reactive, but alive and intentional. This kind of love does not need to prove itself in loud declarations or elaborate gestures. It is revealed in the everyday discipline of care, in the tone of voice he uses when frustrated, in the way he shows up even when he's tired, in the softness with which he protects her peace. He offers his emotional presence not as a performance, but as a practice. He speaks with the awareness that every word he offers has the power to either wound or weave connection. When a man reaches this level of love, he stops trying to be the center of attention and starts becoming the source of stability. His love no longer needs to be loud because it is felt in the calmness he brings, in the questions he asks, and in the quiet confidence with which he says, "This space between us is sacred. I will guard it, speak gently into it, and never take it for granted." And so, when a man deeply loves you, it's not just in what he does, it's in what he begins to say, not to impress you, but to create a space where you can rest, grow, and thrive in love that is conscious, steady, and free.